February's February was a very busy month for games, so if you're caught up in the storm of AAA titles, Dying Light, Horizon, another one whose name is escaping me, you may have missed 2022's first Steam Next Fest. These events are basically tri-annual game showcases hosted on the Steam store in February, June, and October, where hundreds of developers, mainly independent ones, post demos of and host live streams featuring their new and upcoming games for people to try for absolutely free. It's so cool, and I always look forward to it because there are so many fun and unique ideas constantly coming out of the indie gaming scene, and Next Fest gives players a chance to try hundreds of new games for free, while also offering newer and smaller developers the chance to get their games out there and onto people's wish lists. It kind of feels like the closest thing we have to like a gamer farmer's market, or I guess like an artist fair. And I'm all for filling my Trader Joe's pickle bag with local art and produce, so I'm there, dude. During the last Next Fest in February, I managed to play a couple demos during and just after the event, because not all the demos go offline after the event ends, and a lot of games made it onto my wishlist if not directly into my cart. Playing through this Next Fest, while some of the games are much farther along in development than others, I don't mean to exaggerate when I say that these are some of the most impressive and well-crafted game demos I've ever seen. There are some seriously heavy hitters coming to the market either in the near future or for some in just a few weeks. Since I can imagine many of us don't have the most time to sit and play through dozens of demos, I decided to compile a bit of a list of games from this current Next Fest that I think are particularly worth checking out. I wanted to play through as many demos as possible, but I am a humble boy who can only dedicate so many hours to gaming before I can no longer pay rent, so I ended up playing about 30 titles from across different genres and chose my top 16 for this video. I admittedly chose most of them initially based on what I thought looked cool, so there are a lot of first-person games because I guess bias is real and it comes for us all. Some games I spent way more time on than others, so I'll end up moving through most of them kind of quickly and save my favorite and most thorough recommendations for the end. Terra Nil looks to be a super relaxing, low-stakes city-building game with beautiful textures that look hand-painted and incredibly calming soundscapes. Just take a listen. You build a network of structures to try and cleanse and restore greenery to given wasteland tiles while balancing a greenery resource counter. There isn't very much strategic complexity from what I saw, but as I'm no stranger to losing hours to games like Dorfromantik, I honestly think this game does all that it really needs to. Especially with some of the additional content that they're showing in the game's trailers, I feel like this is going to be a great game to just boot up and relax with. A slower-paced horror-themed shooter, Ripout doesn't seem quite as far along in development as some of these other demos, but it has a lot of really creative ideas. The sound design and music are very good at setting that grungy, sci-fi horror atmosphere, and the gunplay feels a lot slower paced and more deliberate, similar to something like Dead Space, with even some enemies requiring precise shots to dismember and critically damage them. It's a bit of a corridor shooter at the moment, which is tricky since it only has a handful of enemies and not a ton of diversity in its scenery, but it has the framework for some seriously expansive systems and customization, so with some more content and some much needed animation optimization, this could be a really strong shooter experience. The Last Worker is a first-person story-driven thriller set in a dystopian future where you play as the last human employee for the increasingly automated company Youngle. The demo didn't last very long and there were some questionable control options, though I was playing a controller, so maybe that one's on me. But it has a strong sense of personality with a comic book art style, full voice acting, light puzzles, a very clear anti-corporate theme, and a narrative experience that I feel like is going to draw a lot of parallels to something like Firewatch.
Looks like someone needs a reset.
Lone Ruin is a top-down roguelike twin-stick shooter with I guess like a trap synth soundtrack that is polished to a shine. The demo only had a survival mode available, which started with a choice between 3 primary spells before setting loose in a contained area to survive for 10 minutes and progressively unlock seemingly randomized spell and player upgrades. There is a standard mode that looks to be a more traditional dungeon crawler, though there's not much mention regarding a narrative or other mechanics, so this one might come down to just how well you mesh with the combat and soundtrack. An isometric survival crafting game, Above Snakes separates itself by putting the player in control of map generation via the researching and placing of different terrain tiles. It's a pretty interesting way to mix up that traditional survival crafting formula, since it's up to you to manage where resource tiles and even unique quest tiles should be placed, adding a nice long-term strategy element to an otherwise exhausted genre. Admittedly, I did bounce off this game a bit at first, since its survival mechanics felt pretty bare bones, but I'm holding out hope that it'll improve significantly with more gameplay and narrative content upon release. Which, I know is a slippery slope, but I genuinely think more narrative presence would do a lot for this game, at least for me. Beneath Oresa is a deck-building roguelike that honestly feels so much like a spiritual successor to Slay the Spire that it's hard to just not directly compare the two. For some of you, right off the bat, that might be more than enough to warrant a purchase, but I do think there are plenty of things that set it apart. There's a 3D comic book art style and a zoning mechanic, which adds positioning to the several layers of combat tactics you need to manage, and a companion system which adds an additional level of bonuses to potentially access during each run. There was no tutorial, and not everything had a tooltip or hint, which has gotta be incredibly disorienting for players newer to the genre, just trying to figure out what even the different symbols mean, but it's very smooth once you start to understand the mechanics and are able to properly plan and build out your run. I have a confession to make. I've never played GoldenEye. As a matter of fact, I don't think I've ever played a shooter older than like Halo 2. And since I'm a little baby boy, the idea of a 90s shooter tribute, while insanely cool, does absolutely nothing for me in terms of nostalgia. I am a big fan of a trend that I've been noticing recently that's very prevalent in this next fest, particularly with shooters. Something of a high-res, lo-fi art direction that I first noticed with the PS1 demake of Bloodborne.
Beasts all over the shop. You'll be one of them, sooner or later.
Similar to lo-fi music, the fidelity of certain elements of the game like the sound, textures, and even controls are intentionally mimicking that produced by older hardware, only usually with an enhanced presentation since the production capability of modern hardware is just so much greater. I feel like this is an entire essay in and of itself, but the point is, Agent 64 Spies Never Die is one of many games intentionally replicating the aesthetic and feel of older games, and I really dig it, despite not actually having played many of the games from the generations actually being replicated. It runs incredibly well, with textures, sounds, controls, animations all feeling, I'll say classic, and it plays exactly how I'd want a remaster of a 64-era shooter to play. I have a confession to make. If Agent 64 set out to capture the magic of 64 shooters, then Selaco is doing the same with 90s PC shooters like Doom. Its shooting and movement both feel incredibly tight and responsive, and the sound design is great, though more modern compared to its retro pixel art visuals, making for a very unique blend. There are a few disrupting frame dips here and there, but everything is mostly very clean presentation-wise. Wrapping up our retro shooter corner, Cultic is my favorite retro shooter of the titles that I played, and is subsequently the first in a series of demos that I'm going to be calling the big guys. Whether it be for their polish, design, or creativity, these games are my top tier picks. That in no way means any of the other games on this list, let alone the other 1,000 featured in the next fest, aren't any good. These are just the ones that really stood out to me. For Cultic, the visual atmosphere blends horror and noir in a way that works very well with this retro art style. The main story seems to follow a detective who rises from the grave to find a police station and surrounding area full of cultist baddies. There are secrets to find, mysteries to uncover, weapons to unlock and upgrade, and plenty of cultist heads to pop. When I returned to the game, I saw that there was also a wave-based survival mode, which I enjoyed despite its pretty brutal difficulty, even when set to standard. But the real standout in this game for me was the sound design, which has this iconic kind of fuzzy crunch that feels like it's being run through the speakers of an arcade cabinet. The music is dramatic, the combat is responsive, the movement feels quick and smooth. If there was one game that was going to break me into this genre, then I think Cultic might be that one game. Angerfoot is an arcadey first-person shooter that may seem very familiar at first glance. After all, it's from the same developers that brought you Terra Nil. Actually, the team working on Wildlife Restoration Simulator are making a first-person Hotline Miami, and it's phenomenal. It's absurdist and addictive, it's smooth and satisfying, it's a 90s Gushers commercial with house beats and homicide. In typical Hotline Miami fashion, you start each level with 1 life and little health, and you try to reach the end as quickly as possible. Each subsequent playthrough relies more and more on your muscle memory as you learn enemy positions and the most efficient way to progress through it. There was a lot of content available in the demo, and from playing through the first 10 levels and boss, I can tell that this is going to be a game that I will waste many, many hours on in the future.
I remember this place like it was yesterday. Wish I didn't.
There's something of a new subgenre spawning from the indie gaming market in the form of rhythm FPSs, and I am here for it. Metal Hellsinger takes a Hellbound Slayer aesthetic reminiscent of the newer Doom games and ties it to a rhythm-based scoring mechanic. It's fairly similar to BPM bullets per minute that we saw launch back in 2020, but has enough differences that make it stand out, sort of a same dessert different flavor. It appears to follow a more linear story, featuring narration from Troy Baker and a soundtrack featuring some pretty heavy-hitting metal musicians, including Serj Tankian. The quote-unquote gimmick is a scoring system tied to taking actions on the beat of the current level's song, which start with just a guitar and drums, then evolve to add more sections and intensity as your multiplier increases from 1 to 16 times. It's kind of like playing Doom Eternal with a stem player, and adds a really powerful layer of feedback for player performance that goes beyond just a numbered score. I am very excited to see what songs and maps the full game has to offer. Moonscars is a 2D gothic Metroidvania that kind of checks all the boxes. The combat feels tight with basic and special attacks, spells, and a parry that all feel highly responsive. There's a shared healing and mana system similar to that of Hollow Knight, and some interesting spite bonuses granted during each run that seem to give a sort of roguelike flair to progression. The story and dialogue seem perfectly cryptic and allegorical for this type of game, and the soundtrack so far is gorgeous, with somber keys, choir, and strings, establishing that core gothic horror ambiance. But of course, as you've been watching this, you've probably realized the real showstopper is the pixel art and animation. It is just top tier. Cult of the Lamb is a top-down 2.5D roguelike dungeon crawler with a cutesy horror aesthetic. You may have heard it called an Animal Crossing with Eldritch Horror, and that's pretty spot on. The level of detail and polish in everything from the sound design and animations to the slight controller rumble when interacting with different objects definitely gives this game that X-Factor edge that just makes me kind of concerned. Are the devs sleeping enough? Should we check on them? Somebody check on them. It's tough to say for certain from just playing a brief demo, but the combat feels responsive and weighty, and the combination of short-term roguelike and long-term colony building elements seem really compelling to me, and I think this title is shaping up to be another must-play from Devolver Digital. Big surprise. Domekeeper was probably my biggest surprise of the festival. It was one of the last games I chose, and I almost didn't play it, but once I did, I couldn't stop until I had beaten it a second time. It's a 2D action roguelike with a simple premise. Start in a dome on an alien world, and mine down until you find the special thing, making sure to routinely return to your dome to fend off monsters who will come in waves to destroy your base. What's so impressive though is this game's balance. You have to progressively upgrade your character and your base defenses, as the monster waves and the ground that you mine will progressively get harder as time goes on. So it comes down to how efficiently you can find materials, choose your upgrades, and survive. Every time I won, it came down to the last few seconds, and my heart was racing the entire time. The game as it stands is worth the price of admission, with satisfying physics, pleasant sound design, and pixel art, and a design that's so intuitive it can be understood without a tutorial. But I'm also so excited to experience the rest of the game's content when it launches. Before we get to our final title, I want to give an honorary big guy to we who are about to die. This game reminds me a lot of an old 360 game I played called Spartacus Legends, if that reference even means anything, and it's sick as hell. It's a third-person action roguelike centered on gladiatorial combat. You start with a fighter and compete in a series of matches, training and gearing along the way until your fighter is eventually killed, and then must be replaced with another fighter from your same sort of guild, with some bonuses carrying over to give you a bit of a boost. The combat is very disorienting and complicated at the start, but it's actually kind of engaging once you begin to progress and get a feel for the swing timings and hitboxes. The animations are a little more gang beasts than For Honor, and there are some bugs and optimization issues for sure, but I expect that with a bit more polish from this game's solo developer, it'll find a strong audience upon release. Full transparency, I could have played more demos, but I spent so much of my allotted time replaying Midnight Fight Express that I just ran out of time. It's incredible. It's a top-down, level-based brawler, and everything from its mechanical feel to its graphical fidelity to its sound design is firing on every single cylinder. Like many arcade-style games, it's one of those where the real game doesn't start until your second playthrough of each level, where you can start completing challenges to unlock cosmetics and earn a place on the leaderboard. The best cosmetics, of course, come in the form of costumes earned after achieving an S rank on a given mission. One thing I'll say that wasn't very clear from the get-go is that there are a lot of modifiers hidden in the settings that are on by default, such as the HUD and checkpoint systems, which, when you turn them off, makes the game significantly more difficult but also gives you huge score bonuses. This is all I've ever wanted, and thankfully the combat has enough depth and versatility to have a high enough skill ceiling for this sort of scoring system to really flourish. You can play through levels on normal difficulty with full assists, learn your enemies, your skills, the map's pace, then turn off everything on subsequent playthroughs for the highest amount of score multipliers possible, and just try to rack the points up. Fighting atop a moving train, no HUD, health regen indicators or checkpoints, and clawing your way to the finish line to unlock a night costume, only to take that night costume into an earlier level and slam down easier enemies to grungy synthwave makes my heart sing. Every once in a while, an indie game will come around that further defines the bar for what small and passionate game development teams can produce, and every time I find out that these games are developed by a single person, it makes me so hyped. I want to give this developer my money. I want to buy and work out to the soundtrack. I want to marathon this game to completion, then finish the game. Midnight Fight Express is my top game of the June 2022 Steam Next Fest, and I highly recommend you check it out if you're able. That concludes... Oh god. That concludes my look at game demos this time around, but please remember that while I may have showed off over a dozen demos, there are thousands of games out there that deserve just as much attention, if not more. So I encourage you to show some of our smaller devs some love if you can. Try some demos, wishlist some titles if you're interested, and let them know that as long as they keep cooking up bangers, we'll keep supporting them. Thanks for watching, y'all.